Hello. I'm here today with cartoonist Tom Manning, um, who has produced several large and ambitious graphic novels. Um, I'll throw up some. I'll do this actually in the beginning and the end. Little cheat sheet I made of some information. tommanning.info.com. There's 3 books for sale there, and there's also his earliest book available as a PDF download. He's on Twitter at Mr. Tom Manning and just Tom Manning on YouTube um, at Robots and Monkeys. I never can tell if YouTube, that at thing actually works or not for finding anybody, but they let us choose them. So I guess I'll mention this is sort of a tie-in here. First issue of Canon features an interview with Tom Manning. This is his art here on the cover, which he generously provided from his book Bearing Straight. Also features an essay or a rumination on your work by Ryan Carey, a noted critic. And I guess I'll throw this up too, just for the hell of it. Some Canon ordering information. canonzine.bigcartel.com. Or you can shoot me an email at loadingthecanon@gmail.com, and I will answer any questions you might have. So, Tom, thanks for coming on and doing this with me.
Very excited to. Congrats on the first issue. It's an honor to grace the cover. So thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate you talking to me. I contacted you out of the blue, so that's always dicey to see if somebody's going to want to talk or not. But I really appreciate your faith in that, and hopefully you were happy with your coverage, which was all glowing.
Oh yeah, no, it's honestly, Ryan. Like, I will completely admit to a degree of ego stroking that was welcome. That was like really touching. Ryan's his writing about, because he was new to my work and having the discipline to read all my books, and then I think a wonderful kind of through line that even for me was insightful. It's rare when you kind of get a stranger to give you their feedback of your work so far and the themes that are embedded in it, and I thought it was fantastic. I let my ego just soak it in and read it with glee. It was a great article.
That's good. Yeah, I don't know how much, if any, research he did on you outside of just reading the text, but I noticed in that piece he mentioned things like American Gothic. There were definitely, David Lynch he mentioned. There were certain things that I know you've mentioned in other interviews. But I think any reader would come to that conclusion too. So
I would think I really was pretty surprised, for as much as you probably know. I often talk about kind of the strain within American art of Gothic American surrealism, and for him to talk about American Gothic, it's great. If that bubbled up naturally, that's wonderful.
Nice. Well, I kind of thought maybe we just go sort of in order. Let you talk about some of these books just a little bit and whatever comes to our mind. I won't dwell on this one too much since it's your first book. And also it's impossible to find.
How do you get a hard copy of it? That's incredible.
Do you know how many copies there are of this?
100. It's just 100 copies of it. It's really amazing. Yeah. I printed 2 runs of 50.
Okay.
Yeah, so that I don't know how you got a hand on one of the 100 copies, but that's pretty amazing.
Well, the miracle of the internet, that's the only way you can do anything nowadays. You look long enough and you're patient enough, you find almost anything.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
Just want to say hi. This is a friend of mine, Ray, here. He just read Bearing Straight, and Eric is next on his list.
It's the next.
Yeah, thank you, Ray.
Super appreciated.
So, Race Car, that was a student project of yours?
Yeah, so I went to undergrad at Occidental College, which is in Los Angeles, and you're supposed to do a senior thesis basically, and I was art and art history, and so I decided to do my thesis as a graphic novel, and it was I didn't it doesn't read like a thesis, but it's sort of a comment on modernism and the death of the author, and very much as anyone who's read Race Car, there's this god in it, the creator, and the protagonist in it is as lost as the reader is, and it's sort of a meta commentary critique on the death of the author, which I just disagree with, as the postmodern idea of death of authorship. So, but it jumps genres. So even back then, for those who read, like, the protagonist jumps through kind of multiple stories, and each are drawn in a very different style. And already then I was, as people probably are, if they're fans of comics like we are, that go way back, like this was 98, 99. It just, comics were really trying to prove their case at the time. They weren't as celebrated as literature. And so I really wanted to pull on the genres of comics and kind of celebrate the variety. And that really carried on to Runoff. And Runoff, of course, is, people are trapped in this town, but all these genres are also trapped as well in a meta way. And so Race Car, that's a long way of saying that, yeah, Race Car was a senior project that was sort of both a meta commentary on authorship, but also trying to kind of flex the range that the comic book medium can provide. And there's so many things I look back at it and cringe at, but at the same time I feel like as like a standalone book, it really gave me the confidence that I could actually get something published. And finally, what I'll say is, I think one thing with both Race Car and Runoff that I actually love is, if you look at the beginning of Runoff, my drawing style, my inking style, my lettering style is kind of trying to get its footing. And by the end, my style is quite different. But I always sort of liked that evolution that is just, as Runoff is an artifact of, and Race Car is also one of those artifacts that the beginning art and the end art, you just see progression. And when Runoff was republished as an omnibus, the publisher at the time, One Piece, was asking if I wanted to redraw the first half of Runoff because of that. I'm like, no, like I love that. I personally am totally fine that there's sort of an inconsistency of style, and that you slowly, of course it wasn't on purpose. It just is an artifact of me drawing daily and making. Yeah. Sorry, long answer.
No, that's fine. That's perfect. I'll mention, since you mentioned Runoff, here's another friend of mine, Sean. Runoff was astounding. I recommend it to everyone. Sean is, I think we talked about him when you and I did a chat before for Canon. He's an art dealer, and he was a guy that I got to read Runoff, and he was really blown away by it. And Sean doesn't hand out hyperbolic praise like that too often. So
I really, again, I really appreciate it. Yeah.
With Race Car, it is raw, but it's actually the last book of yours I read, because before I just had a printed out copy that I right, kind of done the best I could with
PDF for free online. Sure. Right. Yeah
exactly. But I really enjoyed it, and it's definitely the lower work of the 4 books, but
agreed.
It's still a solid book on its own. It's pretty amazing to me that at that age you produce something. I mean, I don't know how long this thing is. What, 100 and something pages?
Yeah. It's
it's
for sure, but I don't forget
not an insubstantial book for a college kid to turn out.
It's something I consistently delivered on as thick books, I guess.
Yes, that's very true. So I guess let's jump into Runoff then, because So Race Car was published in '99, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
And then Runoff you serialized.
Yeah, right.
And the big fat book came out in 2015. So that's
right.
A long time.
Yeah, yeah.
How'd you stay focused that long?
Oh man, I guess because it was serialized and was able to come out in a drip by drip fashion, I felt obligated to land the plane on it. Yeah, and there's the omnibus, and
Yes.
actually, for preparation, I kind of pulled down old school. Yeah, do I have it with me? Oh, I don't know if I do. But this is issue 2. It started out, in 32-page installments like this that I self-published.
Yeah. Okay.
And then I would be going to the Alternative Press Expo. This was like 2000, and selling these individually at the Alternative Press Expo and some other indie comic conventions. And I remember at one point, I just said before I was going to APE that I was interested in collaborating with a publisher. And Odd God Press, which was based in Virginia, reached out to me and kind of committed to finishing that. And there's I don't have it near me, but like then it moved on to these 3 chapters. Chapter 1 was like a republishing of all the work. Then chapter 2 and chapter 3 I finished in completion before publishing them through Odd God. And that was from 2000 to 2007 or 2008 was actually when I wrote Runoff. And I was 20 something at the time, and I think it just was having enough energy to work a full day and then work a second job a full night. I remember when I was in graduate school, the majority of chapter 3, which is the largest volume, was done in the summer between my 2 graduate school years. And I set myself a deadline, and I had to do, I think, 2 pages a day, which is about 16 hours of work. And left to myself, I went completely nocturnal. It was kind of one of the most amazing moments of my life to have that freedom. But for about 3 or 4 months, I basically was completely nocturnal and worked through the night on Runoff, slept in the day, worked all night long. And the end of Runoff was done on this really weird bender I went on to dedicated to finishing the book. And I have kids now and other things to be responsible for, but then I could do that. I don't think I could do that now, but that's how I was able to finalize to do that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a 450-page book, and you talked about how the art changes from the beginning to the end, and it does. But I think the world you create is so fully formed that it's not distracting at all. And I guess it'd be much worse for you to rush things at the end and have it look haphazard. So it's better that it grows as you are going, that you become more and more assured.
Right. It's sort of glacial enough that you may not catch it unless you flip back and forth, I find. But it's true. Like, I'm really happy to hear you say that, because writing all my books, but especially especially Runoff and Eric, was a tightrope walk between a lot of tones. But Runoff, because it was more an ensemble story, was probably plot-wise the trickiest to make sure that all these characters were kind of moving the plot along, or I'm not forgetting the thread. And so that was a really hard book to both do the tightrope walk of the styles, but also kind of give each character their due and make sure that there wasn't an over-reliance on one character moving the plot forward, but spreading it out and making it feel like a town or multiple towns kind of squashed together.
Yeah, I think in Ryan Carey's piece, he mentions that you're juggling a lot of balls in the air in that book. There's a lot going on. And you're able to maintain a certain momentum while you're reading it, that I think I can imagine reading it serialized. I wouldn't remember anything from part to part,
point.
you know?
Yeah, totally.
it's like people who, people would read Cerebus, 20 pages at a time, and I never did that. I always read them in the book. So
Yeah, same here.
yeah,
Yeah, right,
yeah,
right. That would be
uh,
crazy. That'd be so.
yeah. You just have a whole issue of someone just drinking a beer, and then it's like, well, what was
Yeah,
that
right,
I
right,
just?
right. Yeah, that's.
Um, so when you create these books, do you write everything up front? I mean, do you have like a full script for yourself?
Well, because like each page takes a good amount of time, because you know, I letter it, or I pencil it, I ink it, I letter it. I rarely want to have to redo a page, so I
Mhm.
want to be pretty confident when I'm putting down is gonna stay. So I do a lot of pre-work as far as with all the books, I kind of knew the general idea of the ending, and a lot of scenes cropped up as I kind of got the feel for the the worlds that I was in. But I do everything sequentially. Like I really go through it page by page, but I'm planning out, I'm blocking and thumbnailing pages. Like I'm inking a page, thinking about, you know, X amount of scenes ahead, and then spending some time like finalizing the next scene to move it. Kind of, I have different production lines going, like in the abstract, bringing a scene together, and then I might be writing a dialogue for another scene that's a little closer, and I might be thumbnailing a scene that's really close. And then whenever I approach a scene that I think of as a complete scene, I do really detailed thumbnail of the entire scene. And one reason I really don't like to I don't release my book digitally is like everything I plan in spreads. So I'm very cognizant of what page is the sister page to that. So I always lay my thumbnails out as a spread and try to hit a beat at the end of the right page. And so I just have this weird production line of different fidelities of the scenes coming down. Um, but all that said, I start pretty confident knowing how it's going to end, and do a lot of stuff like character design up front. So I
Okay.
don't feel like, oh, I should have had that, that character be a woman, or that was the wrong look. I really want to nail in my character designs and
Mhm.
characters before starting, because that's the hardest thing to go back and replace, because everything's done by hand. I don't do it digitally.
Yeah. Um, I want to come back to that about the traditional pages. I'm astounded though that you allow yourself that much freedom. Um, just because your books are not open ended. I mean, they come to a logical, even if you don't know it's logical before you get there, but they come to a logical conclusion. There's a very strong ending. Um, there's so many comic series of over the years that you could tell they didn't really know when they were going to land the plane. It was like, let's get as
Yeah,
many issues in as we can, and a
totally.
lot of a lot of Vertigo comics were like that. It's
Yeah,
like, oh, if we
totally.
get
Yeah,
70 issues, that's great. But then at the end, they don't really know what to do.
right.
Um, but
It
yours
really,
definitely
okay,
come
keep
to a
going. Yeah.
oh, sorry. They just come to an end point that has its own internal logic. And so but that is quite a tightrope to walk, trying to I don't know, do you have in mind how long they're going to be ahead of time,
No,
or
no, because scenes get added, and there's so much that I kind
Mhm.
of feel out. So it's not so tightly planned that it feels like strict, but I get scenes that they just are kind of epiphanies to me as I'm doing it. Frankly, the scene in Bearing Straight with the door, I didn't start out knowing I was going to have that scene in it. That scene really
interesting?
came to me about a third way, and it's so pivotal.
Mhm.
But I knew that of a moment like that. Like I see Bearing Straight very much like as 2000, very similar to Kubrick's 2001, where it's compared to my other books,
Mhm.
it's very slow. It's got a lot of quiet and landscape, and then kind of this ending that is like passing through the monolith and gets a little more like my normal. I flip stuff up. I keep my powder dry a bit longer than in Bearing Straight than
Mhm.
I did. But I knew there'd be something that kind of crossing into the monolith moment. But I didn't know
Yeah.
exactly how I was gonna do it. And so I say that just because I know that is such a pivotal point in the book. But I went in making the book knowing that I'll work out exactly how I want to do that switch. Um, So it's even things like that. I knew I'd ruminate over the right way to execute that switch in the book. I say that just to say like how loose certain things are when I start out. But I was gonna say, I'm kind of obsessed with landing the plane with good endings, and it in a way comes with my love and hate of Stephen King, where Stephen King is setting up an amazing premise, but he so rarely lands it in the third act that like I grew up reading a lot of Stephen King and just was like almost wishing that I could just know when to stop, or just, and that's why I think he's maybe a better short storyteller, that you can just dip in and out, because he just, yeah, anyway. So that got me really in, if it's a graphic novel, and I consider a graphic novel like there's a beginning and an end and a single spine, I want to deliver on the novel part, and I think one part of that is a meaningful ending, and so I really really obsess over trying to land the best ending for the reader as possible. And for people, as an aside, like one of the reasons it was hard and I decided to self-publish Eric is a lot of publishers did not, they wanted to change the ending, and I was absolutely 100% crystal clear on what the ending was going to be. And for readers of Eric, there's a lot of ambiguity in that ending, but that is exactly the right ending for that story, and I was very very adamant about that. And so even endings that like Eric that are ambiguous, to me is like that was very 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 considered as the right ending, I think, for that story.
When they want you to change the ending, do they want a feel good ending? Do they want it just to be more spelled out?
Yeah, more spelled out, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I mean, I don't consider myself Lynchian. I certainly don't delve in dream logic, and to your point, like I want my readers to feel that it all made sense in the end, even if it's kind of a bonkers logic or ride, but
Sure.
um but so to that end, I think that like unlike Lynch, where it's sort of dream logic, I think that I want the reader to like leave a book, like run off and ruminate what that ending means to them. And I think that's the message that I want to carry forward as a meaning of the book. Where I think, yeah, anyway, there's always some ambiguity. I don't like it when endings feel so tied up in a bow that it feels almost artificial. I want to trust the intelligence of the audience and write as good of good and entertaining of a story as I can. And I think part of that is trusting the intelligence of the reader. And yeah, I think comic book readers are really intelligent.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when I was first telling Ryan Carey about your work, the word I used was Kubrickian, which I don't know how often that word is used. You hear Lynchian a
It's high
lot, or
praise. It's high
Kafkaesque.
praise. Yeah, right.
But Kubrickian was the word that came to me. And as you're talking about your endings, there's definitely kind of a 70s cinema feel to them, as they
Yeah.
don't need to be reassuring. They can be somewhat ambiguous, but not ambiguous because we couldn't figure out how to end this thing, but because the human condition is messy, and therefore we can leave some
Right.
threads open,
Exactly.
which
I mean,
that seems to have disappeared from Hollywood. But
yeah, the finality, like the definitive finality, is so artificial. Like all life, the ends of life end in ambiguity or some, and yeah, exactly. Like when things are so tied up in the bow, it's almost as artificial as something that is unbelievably abstract. They're both completely unbelievable. So endings should have a sort of, I feel good endings, sort of self-reflection on that, because if everything's absolutely buttoned up, it's almost not paternal, but like it's like, tut tut little one, that's, everything's answered and you don't have to think about this anymore. If anything, I want a piece of art or a piece of work to start when you finish it to continue thinking about it. And if everything's buttoned up and if everything's dotted and all the T's are crossed, you're not going to think about it again. But I think good art, when finished, sits with you for a while, or yeah. I mean, and one great way to do that is for well-intentioned ambiguity to land with you as a person. That's what I love talking about other people with things like that, or cinema like that. There might be totally different takes on them. Let's say the end of 2001, for example. Like, that's such a great ending to talk with others about because of that wonderful ambiguity.
Well, tying into that, here's noted YouTuber AFPC. What are some of your favorite endings in comics or in other mediums, ambiguous or not? That's a big question, but do you have anything that?
Oh man, this might sound really. I love the end of Watchmen, Ellen. You know, the end of Watchmen, the alien explosion in Manhattan, the dark horse, or the pale horse. It's been a while. I really love the end of Watchmen.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because I'm a massive Alan Moore Watchmen guy, and the guy who asked the question, AFPC, is not a Watchmen guy, so it's something I have to know. So that's the perfect answer. So I appreciate that. But I felt the same way. I read Watchmen when I was probably 15, ish, and it blew me away, and mostly the construction of it, how it's such a finely made story. I know people want to nitpick about its, outer limits type derivative story, but I kind of think that misses the point of that book a little bit, criticizing the ending.
I think, and again, it's an ending that, and the ending brings up an ambiguity of where the world goes from there. But it's Ozymandias's belief, and you don't get validated if he was right or wrong. It's just like, it's a great ending, because I think it does count as an ending, but it also counts as something like you ruminating is this is how hard we need to be corralled as a all right, he's on Team Watchmen.
Yeah, I don't know if he's messing with me or not, but
but anyway, yeah. So I think that comes to mind as one of my favorite endings. Yeah.
Nice. Okay. When you were doing Runoff, and there was such a long journey, to have the whole thing in one big book in front of you, were you approaching it as, I'm going to get this book done, and if that's all I ever do, fine? Or did you all along intend to keep going, since you were doing things sort of on your own?
Yeah. I think it was a mix of both, where the idea of Eric began to spring up when I was wrapping up Runoff, and then it was like a story or a character really that I couldn't get out of my head, which was a different origin from Runoff, which is really sort of a love letter to my hometown, which basically is exactly like the town in Runoff, where Eric, I don't know anyone like Eric, but it was this character that got into my head after seeing this infomercial that I couldn't get out of my head, and I felt like I just had to start telling the story of this of Eric. So going in, I always sort of like approached, I made this call for good or for bad, and it's something I still wrestle with, is that I wanted to make the kind of books I want, and therefore not rely on making comic books my livelihood, which meant that I felt like I'm a bit of a prima donna, and I really want to control everything. Obviously, like, I pencil it, I ink it, I letter it, and I publish my past couple books, because like I didn't want to feel like I had to start compromising consciously or subconsciously from the type of stories I want to tell to make a living. So finishing up Runoff, Runoff finished the same year I was finishing graduate school, and in my head I was like, I'll go work on what I was studying and just continue to keep my comic book work as I don't want to say a glorified hobby, but like kind of a secret second profession.
Sure.
That as I grew to work for myself, I dial up and down and take longer times to set aside to work on my books. But I think by doing that and not trying to make my full living off of it, the pros and cons are weighed. But one pro is just I can tell the stories I want to tell when I feel like I need to do it.
I was surprised when I was kind of just taking some little notes before talking to you today. Eric came out in 2018. Now I know you were working on Runoff for a very long time, and so you were all wrapped up by the time the big book came out. But that still seems like a pretty quick turnaround. It's another 400-page book. It's, you know, as you said, you have lots of things going on.
But I started Eric in 2008. It actually took me 10 years to finish it. Yeah,
okay.
It took me 10 years. So I finished Runoff in 2007, and I started Eric in 2008, and it took 10 years to finish that
Wow.
book.
Okay.
It was, and then, but Bearing Straight was my quick turnaround. I finished Eric in 2018, as you pointed out, and then finished Bearing Straight in 2 years. And so that was the fastest I'd done a book. But yeah, sort of behind the scenes making Eric, that was a 10-year slog.
Okay. It shows, though.
I shouldn't call it a slog. It was. Unlike Runoff, I wanted it completely done before I released it, and so it was weird to be in year 5, year 6, year 7 with like a stack of Bristol boards as high, and like no one's seen it yet. You know.
Yeah.
So.
Well, you can call it a slog. You're the one who did the work, you know. So, it doesn't read like a slog. It reads very smoothly. Once again, that's pretty amazing that something you worked on for so long, you were able to maintain such a consistent tone, and visually it doesn't look compared
to Runoff, totally, it's a lot more consistent. Agreed. Yeah, totally. And as an aside, like I may not be apparent if it isn't to people who read Bearing Straight, but I personally felt like I needed to do a totally different style for Bearing Straight. I wanted to be a lot more photorealistic. And so like I did a lot of work changing my inking style, at least on how I inked nature and backgrounds before I started that book. And so kind of to that same end, unlike Runoff, I did a lot of pre-drawing to get a new style sort of baked into me before I started the first page on Bearing Straight. But I still feel good that and it's not surprising because a couple of years that Bearing Straight is a bit more consistent, but like the 10-year run of doing Eric, I am kind of surprised that it does seem as consistent as it is.
When you I don't want to just gloss over Eric because I think it's a hell of a book. But in the interest of time, and also because Bearing Straight's my favorite, I'm going to go ahead and jump to that. But it is such a tonal shift from the other books. I guess in the sense that it really breathes. The pacing is not slow by any means, but I mean, you have wide open pages. It reads very easily. Even when you get, it ramps up to near the end with the, I don't want to give anything away to anyone who's going to read it, but the momentum builds towards the end, towards the revelation. But it's still, it reads so smoothly. Kind of, even though they're totally different comics, kind of reminds me of Bone a little bit. Bone is another book that is very easy to read and also picks up in momentum as it carries forward. So was this a way to make your life easier, not having so many balls in the air, or was it just the nature of the story you were telling that dictated the style?
Yeah, the latter. And just I'll admit, as a treat, I had to store it up here, but knowing that you like Bearing Straight, I brought down, these are all the Bristol boards of Bearing Straight back here, but I thought at least it'd be nice to. So this is a pack of Bristol boards to myself. This is a note that this is the beginning of chapter 8. As you know, I do it in Roman numerals, but this is, so here's an original page from Bearing Straight.
Gorgeous.
And I mean, to the end of, I'm trying to put to the end of like just my obsession of what I drew kind of being what's on the page. I just, other than the gray tones, this is, the, and so these are just big stack of, oops. Oh yeah, sorry. You gave me full screen. That's so nice.
Yeah, you're good.
But yeah,
you're good.
so this is, this is the taste of kind of what is actually an end product from my end. And admittedly, your question was about and here's, for example, like this is here is a product of doing it by hand, where other people I think would Photoshop. Let's see if I'm doing this right. The repeated patterns of this, like I just, for evidence, I redrew the damn things every single time.
Yeah.
So like no cheating whatsoever on. I'm really committed to actually doing the real and then here's, well, I guess the next page would be a spoiler, so I'll stop it there.
Okay. This is
but your question. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, you go ahead, and then I'll get to the question that somebody asked.
So your question about approaching it real quick is just that I knew, unlike my books that jump around genres, but this one I wanted to, like I said before, kind of hold my powder dry and tell a pretty like straight and consistent story tonally until the final third. And so it was in a way an easier story to write, but I gave myself certain restrictions, such as working with this UC Berkeley anthropologist whose expertise is early hominins, and I had everything pre-vetted with her to make sure it's anthropologically correct. Of course, not the story, but like the abilities, the clothing, the way the different hominins look, the Neanderthals, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, and so on. Sorry, but yeah, what was the question?
Okay, AFPC here again. This is a question I had too. Curious about your fidelity to physical materials. Have you been tempted to work digitally?
No, I'm so I've been tempted to work digitally just because I'm such a dogma. Like there's certain, I love restrictions, and so I'll just quickly say, like, I never use thought balloons. I never use third person exposition. Like, 3 days later, I always work in black and white. I do as much as I can by hand. Once they stop making the electrotone adhesive, paper, I was doing all the gray tones by hand with an X-Acto knife before they stopped making those. And then I scanned those and had those in fills in Photoshop. So they're just restrictions that I personally take on for all my work that I just kind of obsessively stick to. But also, frankly, I work so much on a computer as a designer that, like, I find it so rewarding to work physically and just analog. Sure.
Yeah, I was curious about the tones. In fact, I had talked to AFPC privately. We were talking about your work, and I was curious. I knew that you worked traditionally. I was curious how you were getting those effects.
Yeah.
So you scanned in old tones and then I'm using those.
Yeah. What's funny is I'm grabbing all these odd. Behind me here is actually some old original runoff pages, and like, I don't know if you can tell, but this is actually, I don't know if you can tell the sheen of it, but this is cut with an X-Acto knife.
Okay.
The gray here is actually on, and you can see I used to work on a smaller format. This was like 1:1.
I see that. Huh.
It's just I changed that. I work like reduce about 60%, but this is how I started doing runoff of this. And so like the gray tones, you can tell,
Wow.
like, yeah, I cut those in with an X-Acto knife.
I mean, since Runoff is your largest book in terms of dimensions, and yet you're working so much smaller.
Yeah, though starting on chapter 5, I did switch over to the larger format. The first 4 chapters are done in this 1-to-1 format, but I don't think I'm a very good letterer, and so I thought that my lettering might look better at a reduced amount. But what I did is because I had all these Letrotone patterns, I just scanned the Letrotone patterns that I had and then created autofill in Photoshop. And so I continue today to still use the Letrotone that I used to use on Runoff on like Bearing Straight and Eric. And when I had to move to digital gray tones and Runoff, which is kind of the second half of the book, it was using the same gray tones that I would hand apply before. And I mean, this was like in 2000, Photoshop existed, and so many friends of mine were like, just, you can fill it in. Like, I don't care. I'm still doing it by hand. And then they got more and more expensive, and then like a sheet like this big was like $17, and it was so crazy. And I eventually just had to go to Photoshop to fill in my gray tones.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of crazy like that. Is why one answer was someone asking go digital. Like that's what a lot I try to be making this work.
I mean, it's pretty amazing though. You know, I have a friend who swears he can spot every comic that's made digitally, and I think he probably can. But I don't know that my eye is as well trained as some. So
yeah, right.
But I remember I'd read an older interview you had done where you talked about your kind of your rules. Your version of Dogma 95, like, you know, your
exactly.
I letter, I black and white,
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And much of it is like honestly actually pulled from Brian Eno and like the both like that was a big I was always fan of Eno's and his strategic his oblique strategies cards. So the idea of self-restrictions that always stuck with me. And so I kind of have as an oblique strategy cards always put out these restrictions of always black and white, no thought balloons, no exposition text. And it is I guess it is like more like a manifesto or a dogma, but I think of them as self-imposed restrictions. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. None of them are unrealistic in any way. They all make a lot of sense.
Well, other than the black and white, I find like doing those things, especially with text, where the only text I allow is like word, like, speech and sound effects. You get a more cinematic story, actually. I think like you have to show time passing in a way that's really different. That like, and at times I'd really have to think about how am I going to tell someone that this is a week has passed, or like you really got to think through how you're going to do this in a static sequential art way. It's just such an easy button to push to do exposition, or like if you can't do thought balloons, then the body language and the blocking and the composition, you can lean on that to see if someone is distrusting someone else, or like you have to do that through ways other than just a thought balloon being like he's lying. You got to show it in a tone or a subtle like shift in body language, and I just think that actually generates those restrictions surface better outcomes, at least for me.
Yeah, sure. Do you, I mean, well, I don't know how conscious this was at the time you were sort of planning this flag, but were there certain comics or certain cartoonists that made you think of this, or was it coming from just like music and film?
No, well, it was coming from all over the place, but like, I mean, I have to say Dave Sim and Cerebus was probably the biggest inspiration of all my work. Everything from, in Runoff, by like the way he would draw cartoonish Cerebus with like the gorgeous backgrounds of Gerhard or just the other genres that he would kind of bring in, and also his call for people to create independently, and he created this great how-to book around self-publishing. I think it was in the late 90s or mid 90s, and that really was the definitive guide for me of how to start Runoff and get Runoff going. And so, and also, like, even though he does thought balloons, and I honestly forget exactly why I would attribute my idea to not doing thought balloons and exposition text to Dave Sim, even though I know he uses both to a degree. But I think there was some run that he did, or maybe some scene that he did, that it was really notable to me that he just did it with sound effects and speech. And I somehow, reading some issue of Cerebus, I know that I thought, okay, let's just completely cut out everything but text and sound effects and see what happens. So yeah, I think I'll I'll do some virtue signaling and say, even though like he is problematic in a lot of ways from his personal beliefs, like probably there was no other creator that informed me or as a maker of comics than Dave Sim.
Did you ever have any contact with him? Did you ever send him your work?
I did. This is honestly amazing. This is really, really amazing. As I would mail him Runoff in Canada when he was in Canada, and to his credit, he mailed me back. He mailed me back physically. He put over tracing paper over. I remember it was a scene in Runoff where they're sitting in Balduino's cabin with Joe Madsen's got his feet up on the table, and underneath is where, well, I guess that would be a spoiler, but they're all sitting in Balduino's cabin, and he put over tracing paper over that, re-inked it, sent me that with ink notes, and he talked about, hey, like in a really, really positive way. He was like, great, let me give you some pointers on inking, and it sent me, it was probably like a 12-page type letter about ink. I just couldn't believe it. And I was an art director for a magazine called Filter in the early 2000s, and every issue, even though I would interview an artist, and one issue I was like, I want to interview Dave Sim. So I was also able to interview and publish an article interviewing him back in, I don't know, 2002, maybe 2001. But yeah. So I ended up having a lot of correspondence with him, and I am stunned still how much he would respond back. It was unbelievable. Like 12, like I said, like 12 single line page typed responses.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, he's a famous correspondent. He replied to a lot of people. I mean, he even published a couple of volumes of his letters. I don't know if you've ever seen those.
Oh no, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think he did about 2 years worth, and then realized nobody wanted them, so they just didn't appear anymore. But they're fascinating because it's sort of thing. I mean, if you're a reader of literature, you're used to seeing letters of Hemingway, and and so this was the logical next step of him saying, listen, I engage with all these other people, I'm thinking about all these things, and I thought it was a great idea. I just, obviously there's hardly enough people to read the comics, much less to read the letters. So
I remember at the end of Cerebus, well, it was funny, like he'd go on these diatribes about Islam or Abrahamic religions, and like I feel like some issues there may be like 5 pages of and then like 20 pages of like his part 7 of Oh My Islam, like, oh my god. I just remember his books turning slowly into these no,
for sure,
the dude writes a lot.
These polemics that just go on and on about it's definitely a unique look into a person's mental state over the course of 20 something years.
Right,
Um,
right, right.
that's amazing though that he responded to you and gave you such constructive criticism.
Really unbelievable and really thoughtful. I mean, the fact that he re-inked one of my pages. I mean, it's just
Mhm.
like that's so kind, and it meant so much to me, and it was such useful feedback. And
Yeah,
yeah, anyway, yeah, it was great.
that's great. Um, just as a callback to what when we were talking about the restrictions, I think I mentioned this when you and I talked before. But Watchmen was also another book where there were
Yeah,
no thought balloons, no, and I don't know how long Alan Moore kept that up, or if that was just a book or two he was doing that for, but he was also very upfront about wanting to present comics in a sort of um, more adult literary way.
right, right. And I guess what is it? I'm blanking. Is it the Black Frigate, the comic within the comic?
Mhm.
I remember there would be like
Yeah,
correct for the
the
genre,
captions.
the
Yeah,
captions
yeah.
there. But like
Hmm.
even from a layout standpoint, there was the kind of iconic grid of 9 that they stuck to.
Hmm.
So even the layout of the each page, which I can never do. Like my layouts are, I like
Yeah,
to yeah, I think of them sort of as it's something you can dial up and down the layout of your panels, but like to do that whole thing with that strict grid layout of 9 panels, and of course they do splash pages, or maybe one might go across the horizontal, but it always stick
sure.
to that grid. And yeah, that really stuck out to me reading that. Even when I was young, I really caught on quickly, like this, they're sticking to this rigid restriction of this grid of the panels, and I loved it.
Well,
I
even
guess, like, yeah,
yeah, even you approaching things as a two-page spread is sort of, even though that's expansive, that's a restriction in and of itself that you, I mean, that's a certain amount of discipline, right? That you're saying it, something has to flow and come
yeah,
down to this point. I don't
yeah.
think most, I read an older graphic novel recently. Have you ever read David Chelsea in Love? You
No,
remember
no, I
that?
haven't.
It's from the 80s, early 90s. It's an autobiographical. Um, David Chelsea is a guy who lives in Portland. He hasn't really done a whole lot of comics since, but he wrote a book about perspective. So he's a very good
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
artist. But I was reading that graphic novel, and it really stuck out to me that um, the sort of scenes would go and end mid-page and start, and that really stuck out to me as something that no one really does anymore. They don't,
Huh. Yeah.
I think nowadays people do think of more each page as a unit, or they think that the ending
Yeah.
can't be that, they don't leave the apartment in the third panel of the page. Like,
Yeah.
but he was
Right.
just treating it
Yeah.
like, oh,
That's
I'm
a
just,
good point.
everything flows together. Um,
Right.
sort of the exact opposite of what you do, where it's a unit in and of itself.
You're
And
totally
I
right. Like
enjoyed his
we're
book. Don't get
yeah.
me wrong; it's a good book, and he's a good cartoonist. But it really felt like a 30-year-old storytelling, which is what it is. So
It's
um,
funny that you say that. I think like so true because we're about the same age, and I grew up kind of as a Marvel kid, and they're told with pretty quick efficiency. So you could go through
mhm,
3 different places, let's say in a page or in a spread,
yeah,
where you're right. Like I rarely will you see me change scenes in a spread. Like I will let the page turn be a natural break to go to somewhere else without saying it. Like it's just an implied way to transition. And you're right. I think we were really accustomed to scene changed in the middle of a page, and I until you said that I hadn't really thought of how much that has really gone away, and it's true. Like I certainly am not saying that people are following the lead of what I'm
yeah.
doing, but that was something that actually I remember feeling novel even to myself early when I was doing runoff or early on. Is like is not is sticking with these people or this place until the end of that spread, and then having that scene change be the page turn. Um, yeah.
I had one more thing I wanted to ask you about, and I mentioned it in the interview that's in Canon, but you have a YouTube channel. Um, I actually sat down and watched a few of the videos today, just it's been a while since I watched a few of the kind of sizzle reels you've done for books. And then you have I think 3 music videos on there
Right.
that came out of Eric. So I don't even know that I necessarily have a question, but the videos are good. And is to you, are they just there as a sort of promotional function and you don't think about them much more past that, or is it?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I don't know.
mean,
You put work into them is what I'm saying, so they're not just tossed
right,
off.
yeah.
Yeah.
They are sort of promotional sizzles, and like as a graphic designer, I was trained in and did some work within motion graphics and just understand the design of motion graphics. But if anyone who goes to look at my YouTube, there's very little there, and I kind of use them, if anything, just for promotional things for the book. Other than like the conceptual, I do think the songs of Eric are something I'm really proud of, happy that we did, which the idea of Eric kind of being this trans-dimensional entity, this musician from Los Angeles, that and the different genres of the book. I wanted 3 real LA bands of different genres. Leslie Stevens, who is country, the Airborne Toxic Event, which is rock, and Mike Realm, who's a DJ, all LA based, to cover songs from the book, and almost have them be these voices of Eric in our reality. And so I use that. That's probably the things I'm most pleased with about on that YouTube channel is this sort of companion pieces to the books. But yeah, those sizzle reels. I know how to use After Effects,
Yeah.
and I wanted to, provide whatever I can to bring in the peek into the books that were coming. But
Sure.
as you probably noticed, I don't use my YouTube channel much.
Yeah. Have you ever heard from anyone who has discovered you through there?
Yeah. Both like Twitter and I know we talk about this and for like I in both in the issue of Canon and generally I'm an obscure comic book maker, and it's not by design, and so I'm always happy when either people such as you are advocates or pass along, because I don't seem to be the best, haven't yet cracked how I can best be and not an advocate, but evangelize my work in a way that feels genuine. Maybe I'm just not a good marketer at heart, but it's great when people just kind of pop up and reach out, either through YouTube or Instagram and Twitter. That's generally where I hear that people have come across my work. There's also on my website a way to contact me, and sometimes people just write out of the blue, which is great. I mean, they're made to be read, and I'm always so happy to engage with readers.
I'm gonna throw this up on the screen one more time. And I actually went to your website again today, just to make a couple little notes, and it really is a great website. As far as you have your books for sale, race cars available for download. There's links for reviews. There's links to your YouTube channel. So a lot of cartoonists could learn from that. Since sometimes trying to track people's work down or just track them down can be pretty hard. But tommanning.info.com. I don't know if you're going to continue this, but at least currently your books are all on sale too.
Yeah.
So clearly I'm talking to you this much, so I'm an advocate. I really would like people to read the work. Not in a browbeating way, but just I think you've made some really important comics, and it's hard for even the big names to get attention in comics, much less someone who's got a day job and a family, and you're just sort of doing this when you can. So let's do one more question, then I'll get you out of here. This is from AFPC again. Speaking of music, listen to anything while working?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like I find I really like to listen to music. Well, when I'm thinking and I'm trying to ruminate, I listen to music a lot. I'll put it that way. When I
Mhm.
ruminate on scenes, I like to listen to a lot of ambient. I mentioned Eno before, and of course that's a huge thing. But like I repeat it, like Steve Reich's music for 18 musicians. That album gets so much play on my end,
Mhm.
and it's a great just Steve Reich and John Hassel. Anyway, and so and then when I really like to listen to. I can listen to music with vocals. I'm good with that.
Okay.
And that could be a bunch of stuff. But when I ink, I should say it's so methodical that I usually listen to podcasts when I ink
Okay.
because that's just the way, especially with Bearing Straight, my inking sessions would sometimes go 6 to 8 hours in and of themselves, and just
Wow.
methodically inking branches and leaves and blades of grass. So,
Yeah.
uh, yeah.
Um, AFPC also asked about major or minor influences on your stuff, which I will let you answer if you want to. But I'll also point anyone towards, I think it's an interview you did with Sequential Tart
Mm-hmm.
back in the mid 2000s, and you give a pretty good list of stuff in that interview. You talk about the American Gothic surrealism, and I think you give a
Yeah.
whole list of writers and filmmakers and musicians. Um, so,
Yeah.
anyway, I'd point anyone who wants to know about that stuff there. That's great. But anything off the top of your head that you'd like to shout out or name check?
I mean, I would say cinema is a really, to your point before, like Kubrick, and admittedly these are big like
Yeah.
Kubrick and Lynch, just really really influential to me. Honestly, but I don't know why I should even put copy like Tarantino. His play with genre is also just incredible. And I really love painters. So as an art history major, Hopper, I think, is, I would say, like, I, I, I don't know if I would call it a huge influence, but like the paintings of Hopper to me are fantastic. And and then another uh, uh, random, but there's this photographer named Ralph Eugene Meatyard, who's a black and white photographer and has this weird. He would photograph these kids with masks, um, very much like Diane Arbus, who I also really like, Diane Arbus,
Yeah.
and both black and white. So like I love black and white photography and photographers, and Meatyard and Arbus are two. And there's just both with Arbus and Meatyard. There's this weird inherent narrative that's not ambiguous, but that that is so curious that I love. I think that's especially with Arbus, that you can almost imagine the short story that might come with that person that she's photographing. Um,
Sure.
so I like to kind of I like to kind of pull from different sources. I don't read as many comics as one might think. Uh, so yeah, and other than that, um, like Cormac McCarthy as far as prose goes, and yeah, I also I enjoy to read, enjoy reading, though I don't write prose. Yeah,
Mhm. All right. Um, Tom, thank you again for coming and doing this with me. Um, Anybody wants to know more about Mr. Manning, check out Canon first issue. Um, shouldn't be too hard to find if you found this. So I think with that, we'll end the broadcast. Thank you to the people who are watching and that ask questions. Very much appreciate it.
and
Thank
yeah,
you.
I thanks for the questions, and I appreciate it's so great to have you guys all come out, and thank you, Colin, for this. Appreciated it.
Of course.